On our way out of the neon-drenched doors of the Lotus Hub, he kept looking back at the upper VIP lounges. A bouncer had let slip the real reason the starlet never accepted his credits for freedom. Here dolls didn't end appos, to just walk out. The flesh peddlers treated top earners like corporate property. One former star had been bought out by an executive, then dumped back after he voided the contract. Now she was a lowly floor scrubber, available to the gutter trash by night. That was the fate waiting for anyone trying to breach contract. That was when I spotted the woman scrubbing the floor. I recognized her instantly. Vance's ex-wife. After his empire crumbled, she'd crawled back and been demoted to the absolute bottom. She looked up, our eyes locking through the holographic lighting. Pure hatred, then raw fear. Before she could process my presence, the madam materialized, backhanding her with a metal prosthetic, screaming at her to work faster. I felt nothing for her. In Sector 7, you lived and died by your choices. I handed my new recruit, Jax, our rations and muttered, "Everyone controls their own fate. What you can't hold on to has zero value." He ripped open a container, shoving a synthetic protein stick into his mouth. I kicked his boot. He grinned, chewing loudly, saying he was just following my advice. Jax was a brute, but sharper than he let on. I escorted him to the underground courier agency. The smugglers sketched a rough digital rendering of the missing girl based on Jax's descriptions, and I extracted coordinates of his old sector to narrow the search algorithm. The syndicate's datanet covered the entire underground grid. If she had a pulse, they'd locate her. Jax noticed how the agency treated me. The ringleader called me brother, and his runners hung on my every syllable. He asked what my relationship with them was. I casually informed him the ringleader was simultaneously my business partner and future father-in-law. Jax stared, his cyber optics twitching in total confusion. I brought him to my fortified settlement. The hydroponics bay glowing under UV lights, the scrap iron kiln, the automated defenses. His scarred face shifted as he realized the sheer scale of the operation I had secretly built. I offered a straight deal, a permanent, climate-controlled hab unit. In exchange? Unwavering loyalty. He understood immediately. Back in the central hub, he earned credits, but never owned a safe space. What I offered was a real route in a world of scavengers. He agreed instantly, vowing to follow me into toxic zones. I sent him with the next convoy to collect his plasma forging tools. I had my quartermaster pick out a prime spot near the scrap kiln for Jax and Appo's new workshop. A mountain of salvaged mech armor from the Water Rat gang was waiting for him to melt down. With his future secured, I headed to my quarters. The Nova twins were already moving our belongings into the newly constructed master hab unit. The thermal core had been running nonstop, pumping heat through the floor plates. The bedroom was 10 degrees warmer than the freezing Wasteland. You could strip down to a light undershirt. I found both sisters arranging the synthetic fur blankets. The view nearly short-circuited my brain. Arya turned first, a soft smile on her face, silver hair catching the light. She whispered the room was wonderfully warm. I set down the food box, crossed the room, and pulled them into a tight embrace. They blushed, protesting there were crates to unpack. I whispered it would go faster with 3 people. Arya feigned resistance for exactly 2 seconds before throwing her arms around my neck, kissing me fiercely. Lyra sighed, playfully rolling her eyes, and started unfastening her tunic. This was our first real night in the fortress. I made sure it was an unforgettable experience. An hour later, both sisters lay exhausted on the tangled blankets, completely spent. I patted their legs and told them to prep evening rations. In the kitchen, Arya noticed the faded stamp on the food box, Neon Lotus. She stared daggers at me, highly skeptical of my innocence until Lyra laughed out loud. Lyra teased that if I ever strayed, it would be their own fault for not satisfying me. Both sisters giggled, threatening that once naive little Alara joined the household, they would coordinate shifts to wear me out completely. I thought about Alara and grinned. She and Appos, be terrified. That evening marked the final hours of my 3-day deadline for Vance to vacate the territory. I went to the perimeter. Just as the artificial sun powered down, I spotted a shadow slipping out the back gate. A servitor drone was pulling a rusted hover skiff. They loaded Vance onto it face down, his mechanical spine still too damaged to sit upright. 4 figures total, Vance, 2 hired muscle, and his tech scribe clutching a data drive. They'd chosen this exact hour deliberately, hoping to slip into the wasteland unseen. I followed quietly from the shadows, blending into the toxic fog. Vance lay on the skiff, frantically whispering to his mercs, asking if the perimeter was clear. The merc reassured him the settlement was dead quiet. But Vance was and Appos, T convinced. He muttered that Kaelen wouldn't and Appos, T just let him walk away with his secret stash. He knew me too well. And he was right. The group crept into the wasteland, thinking they were free. The merc kept telling Vance he had surrendered his territory, so why would I bother hunting him? The old fool actually believed he could reboot his empire. They hit the main road and collectively exhaled. That's when a high-frequency whistle shattered the silence. 5 cloaked figures materialized, surrounding the skiff. Rorik, from the Rust cartel, uncloaked, his monomolecular blade drawn. Vance panicked, holding up a physical cred stick worth thousands, begging for a deal. Rorik didn't blink. He sliced off the hand holding the creds, caught the stick midair, and gave a digital signal. Exterminate. It was over in 3 seconds. The crew was slaughtered instantly. I stepped out of the fog once the bodies hit the dirt. Rorik's enforcers raised their rifles until he barked at them to stand down. He asked if I didn't trust them. I casually replied I just wanted to verify Vance was permanently deactivated. Couldn't and Appos, T sleep otherwise. I inspected the hover skiff. Multiple deep lacerations, core processors destroyed. Vance was thoroughly finished. Rorik found another stash of high-grade tech on the body, far more than the bounty I'd promised. The cartel thugs were ecstatic. I told them to take everything and incinerate the bodies in the acid pits. Rorik nodded, mentioning his boss wanted us sit down to forge an alliance. Tomorrow, high noon. On their way back through the acid-scarred ruins, Rorik's stealth crew bumped into something unexpected. A band of over 20 ragged scavengers wandering the irradiated access road, starving, clad in patched thermal suits, heading straight toward our perimeter. A young woman leaning on a hydraulic crutch stopped them, asking if this was the path to Sector 7 and Appos' central haven. She claimed some underground couriers had told them the overseer here was a pragmatic man, and nobody starved in his grid. Rorik nearly had a system failure. His hover skiff was loaded with fresh corpses wrapped in thermal tarps, and the starving refugees were crowding closer because they could smell the raw biofluids. Rorik slapped the skiff and Appos, as thruster controls, speeding away before any of them looked too closely. Later, one of his enforcers complained about my disrespectful attitude earlier. Rorik shut him down instantly. End quote. You think a man who dismantled Vance and Appos' entire syndicate overnight is someone we can afford to disrespect? Reboot your brain. End quote. I had walked far from the acid pits, not realizing the sheer terror my name now commanded in the underground networks. Wiping out Vance in one surgical strike had left a permanent imprint. The arrival of the discarded. Near the sector's main blast gates, I heard someone calling out over the hum of the plasma generators. I turned to see a group of over 20 exhausted drifters. The young woman with the hydraulic crutch stepped forward, explaining their situation. They were refugees driven from the deep mining levels, directed here by my courier allies. I didn't end Appos' hesitate. I led them straight to the hydroponics bay. People with nowhere else to go possessed a rare commodity, absolute loyalty. I gave them my own high-grade nutrient rations without a second thought. Arya and Lyra immediately booted up the communal synthesizers, churning out huge vats of protein gruel. To these starving drifters, it was a corporate banquet. They devoured everything: my rations, the workers' supplements, every last scrap of synthetic protein. I stood there calculating the margins. If I hadn't and Appos' seized Vance and Appos' territory and plundered his hidden resource caches, I couldn't and Appos' possibly fuel this many bodies. Their leader introduced herself as Kira. She told me they and Appos, D fled all the way from the irradiated outer borders, just looking for a grid that Wooden and Appos, T collapse on them. She swore they'd do any labor as long as I kept their vitals stable. Their lives would belong to me. I ran a quick ocular scan over the group. All able-bodied. 16 men, 6 women, no children. Nobody looked older than 30 cycles. Hardened, useful survivors. I asked what technical specs they brought to the table. Mostly scrap miners and hydro farmers. But Kira mentioned someone named Zane, who claimed to be a hardware tech splicer. I and Appos, D just spent a fortune in credits setting up Jax the cybersmith, so a free tech splicer sounded like a tactical advantage. When I called for Zane, a lanky guy stood up, still licking protein paste from a tin container, his face smeared with engine grease. He didn't and Appos, T looked particularly bright. He asked for a second helping. Kira kicked his shin with her metal leg, scolding him for embarrassing her during a critical negotiation. I smirked, telling him if he wanted infinite rations, he had to prove his processor actually worked. I tossed him a proprietary biometric lock I and Appos, desalvaged from a downed corporate transport, a complex, multi-layered encryption device I used on the armory doors. Nobody in this sector had figured out its bypass sequence, not even the local hackers. Zane caught the lock, pulled a makeshift multi-tool from his belt, and got to work. He didn't and Appos, T just smash it. He interfaced with the microcircuitry, mapped the internal firewall, and bypassed the biometric scanner in under 3 minutes. The locking mechanism clicked open effortlessly. That was all the data I needed. This kid had raw, unrefined talent. A natural-born tech savant. Calculated power. Kira looked relieved. I could tell she was sharper than her ragged appearance suggested. She'd already noticed Rorik hauling bodies on the hover skiff outside the perimeter, and correctly calculated that I was a lethal variable. But she didn't and Appos, T flinch. She understood the brutal arithmetic of this world. In the underground, only the ruthless kept the lights on. She'd become the leader of these scavengers the exact same way by gutting a raider who tried to strip her for parts. Seeing the stable grid, the humming generators, and the fed workers, her mind was made up. She knew I was a tyrant, but a tyrant who protected his assets. A sanctuary like this was a statistical anomaly in the ruins of Neo-Babel. My focus shifted back to Zane. I asked if he could reverse engineer the biometric lock and build EMP-shielded casings. He nodded deadpan. I told him to draft a prototype. He bluntly stated it would take at least a 12-hour cycle, refusing to sugarcoat the timeline. That honest assessment raised his value in my eyes. If he'd boasted he could do it in 10 minutes, I would have flagged him as a liability. I didn't and Appos, T need a basic mechanic to fix rusty pipes. I needed a mind capable of constructing automated defense drones and EMP launchers. That and Appos, S.Y. Zane was the perfect asset, simple-minded, easily motivated by a full stomach, and highly specialized. I promised him a private lab starting tomorrow, fully equipped. However, I kept my advanced weapon schematics heavily encrypted. I didn't and Appos, T fully trust Kira yet. If she turned out to be a corporate spy, a data leak could destroy my empire. I interrogated Kira about the remaining survivors. She listed their specs. The men could handle heavy salvage operations, and the women were skilled in precise circuitry repair and resource processing. Perfect. The Nova twins had been handling all the administrative and physical labor simultaneously without a single complaint. They needed the bandwidth freed up. I assigned the women to maintain the hydro farms and scrap guilds. As for my personal quarters, only the twins had access. Paranoia keeps you breathing. Kira chased after me, demanding a designated role. I respected her drive. I informed her I was assigning 12 scavengers to form a sector guard. She would drill them with shock batons and riot gear. My underlying strategy was deeper than it appeared on the surface. By scattering her original crew across different workstations, I systematically diluted her influence over them. The sector guard would eventually integrate with my veteran mercs, creating a balanced power dynamic. Between the perimeter guards, the salvage teams, and my automated defenses, I'd command a small, localized army. Ascension of the Nova Twins. The next morning, the new operational protocols were initiated. With the menial tasks delegated, Arya and Lyra finally had room to breathe. I realized my expanding territory required a dedicated logistics network. My primary fixer was too busy managing the smuggling routes. So, I turned to the twins. They possessed high-level analytical processing implants from their past lives. Making them the financial core of my empire was the most logical step. End quote. Kaelen, you and Apos, re-giving us master access to the ledger? End quote. Arya asked, her ocular implants widening in disbelief. Lyra didn't and Apos, hesitate. She immediately synced with the holographic interface, her fingers dancing across the projected data streams, calculating every credit and scrap of raw material down to the microdecimal. I was completely at ease. My base was finally self-sustaining. The pristine cartel. By 1200 hours, it was time for my summit at the Spire, the Rust Cartel's notorious high-altitude stronghold. I armed myself with my heavy plasma cutter and concealed a custom-molded ceramic stealth blade in my boot invisible to standard weapon scanners. Rorik was waiting at the designated extraction point outside Sector 7. He looked genuinely impressed that I showed up solo. Going to a warlord's fortress without an escort squad was statistical suicide. I just smirked. My operatives were busy, and dragging Kira into high-level cartel politics was premature. Besides, it was just a gang hideout, not a corporate kill box. Rorik gave a silent nod of respect and signaled his transport. A sleek, customized hoverbike glided out of the shadows. It was a Wraith model, his boss's personal ride. He noted the boss sent it specifically because the Spire was miles up the vertical transit shafts, and they wanted me to arrive in prime condition. That piece of hardware was highly restricted. The gesture told me exactly how seriously they were taking my integration. I glanced at Rorik and his backup, who were clearly intending to travel by foot via the rusted cargo elevators. I raised an eyebrow. I asked how many functioning transports the cartel owned. He laughed bitterly, admitting this was their only intact Wraith. The rest were slow, lumbering scrap haulers. When I asked why the boss didn't ride his own prized machine, Rorik's smile vanished. End quote. You and Apos, I'll understand when you meet him. End quote. I instantly ran the variables. The cartel boss was either physically compromised or entirely cybernetically bound to the fortress. When I reached the upper gates of the Spire, the visual data didn't and Apos matched the reputation. This was supposed to be a den of cutthroats, but it was immaculately sterile. Every steel grate had been chemically scrubbed. The perimeter guards wore uniform tactical gear, not mismatched scrap. The architecture was modular and efficient, with actual bioengineered flora growing in sealed glass tubes. I felt like I had accidentally breached a corporate orbital station, not a raider camp. At the entrance to the main command deck, Rorik halted me. 2 servitor drones floated out, scanning me for radiation and dusting off my armored coat with sonic pulses. A protocol droid offered me a pair of pristine indoor boots. I stared in mild disbelief. Inside the command center, behind a massive hololithic strategy table, sat a refined, synthetic-looking man. His features were painfully pristine, sculpted like an old-world aristocrat. Seeing me, he rose, adjusted his immaculate coat, and offered a calculated, corporate bow. He introduced himself as Wu Jing, the prime architect of the Rust Cartel. Inside the sterile command center of the Spire, Wu Jing gestured for me to sit. The prime architect of the Rust Cartel possessed delicate, synthetic features, his face modeled after pre-collapse aristocrats. He was flanked by his lieutenants. To his right stood Silas, a towering brute heavily modified with industrial-grade hydraulics, serving as the cartel's enforcer. To his left was Valen, a silent, optic-enhanced sniper who commanded their perimeter security. For a gang ruling the upper rusted shafts, their leadership structure was surprisingly rigid, operating more like a corporate board than a syndicate. Silas was the first to speak. He slammed a heavy metallic fist. He was a straightforward brawler with genuine warrior coding. I downed the harsh liquid without breaking eye contact. Wu Zhang observed this exchange with a faint look of annoyance, clearly displeased that his muscle had initiated the diplomacy. I filed that behavioral tick away in my neural implant and remained silent. I cut straight to the point, telling Wu Zhang he didn't invite a rogue engineer up to his ivory tower just to share top-shelf synth liquor. My bluntness startled him. He actually choked on his drink, coughing a splatter of blue cooling fluid into a pristine white microfiber cloth. Despite his high-end chassis, the man's internal systems were failing. He waved off my comment, pressing a button on his console. A reinforced door slid open, and two heavily armored cartel guards dragged in a battered prisoner, throwing him onto the polished floor plates. It was a corporate scout. My tactical processors went into overdrive. Were the cartel planning to sell me out to the upper tiers? Were they dragging me into open treason against Neo-Babel's ruling class? Wu Zhang quickly laid out the data. His perimeter patrols had intercepted 2 scouts attempting to plant tracking beacons near Sector 7. One expired during neurointerrogation. This one survived just long enough to decrypt his memory banks. Valen, who had formerly served in the corporate militia, translated the encrypted files. Winter was approaching the underground. The upper corporate military held the main thermal vents, so a frontal assault was impossible. Instead, the elites had deployed a massive vanguard of Cyber-Fiends heavily augmented, brainwashed shock troops deep into the lower sectors. Their mission was annihilates, just observation. They were here to sever the main hydroponic supply lines, effectively starving out the resistance before the freezing season hit. Wu Zhang wiped the coolant from his chin. He admitted the Spire lacked the heavy ordnance to eradicate the Cyber-Fiends and Oppos, staging ground alone. But if I merged my newly developed tech with his veteran fighters, we could crush the elite corporate vanguard before they struck. I leaned back, tapping my fingers rhythmically against my plasma cutter. I asked if they had confirmed the vanguard's coordinates. Valen nodded, projecting a holographic map of a toxic ravine miles to our west. He had personally scouted the perimeter and recorded massive stockpiles of military-grade energy cores, heavy plasma weaponry, and reinforced exosuits. A chill ran down my spine. The elites hadn't an Oppos, just sent scouts. They had established a forward operating base. If that many heavy troopers hit our supply lines, Sector 7 would be reduced to ash and frozen corpses. But I was an Oppos, about to get swept up in Wu Zhang's desperate plea for survival. I saw right through his algorithm. He wanted those corporate supplies to keep his fortress powered through the winter, and he was using mutual destruction to draft me into his war. I told Wu Zhang I only cared about one variable, the post-mission asset division. The room went dead silent. Silas tightened his hydraulic fists, glaring at me. Wu Zhang dismissed the prisoner and asked me to name my parameters. I held up 3 fingers. End quote. 70-30, end quote. I stated coldly. Wu Zhang's synthetic face lit up, assuming I meant 30% for myself, and generously offered me 40. End quote. Correction, end quote. I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave. End quote. 70 for my sector. 30 for the Spire. End quote. Silas roared, arguing that his scouts had bled for this intel. I cut him off instantly. Without my tactical blueprints and EMP technology, their assault would be a mass suicide against corporate shielding. I told them they could either take 30% of a massive armory, or 100% of absolute zero. My logic was flawless, leaving zero room for debate. Wu Zhang agreed. He had no alternative. To soften the blow, I proposed categorizing the loot. They could claim the majority of the raw energy cores and synthetic rations, which they desperately needed to survive the cold. I was an Oppos, entirely heartless. What I truly wanted were the pristine corporate weapons and exosuits to arm my newly formed sector guard. With the contract verified, I immediately departed. I needed to prep the perimeter. When I arrived back at my fortified hab unit, I found Arya and Lyra running around the metallic courtyard, laughing as they played with two feral cyberhounds I had salvaged weeks ago. The terrifying beasts had been reprogrammed and now behaved like loyal, oversized puppies around the twins. Another figure stood near the scrap kiln today, Ilara. The moment she heard my heavy boots on the grating, her face flushed crimson. She was still holding on to the memory of me saving her from a rogue corporate drone a week prior. I hadn't oppose. T briefed her on the impending raid. With her impulsive, hot-headed nature, she would demand a spot on the front line, which was a tactical liability against elite shock troops. She marched over, shoving a small metallic box of rare, pre-collapsed chocolates into my chest. She claimed she bought them off a smuggler, stammering that I should eat them to keep my glucose levels up, acting aggressively indifferent. Then she spun on her heels, warning me about the upcoming underground fighting circuit, telling me not to get cocky just because I had some fancy new guns. She stomped away, kicking loose bolts off the walkway. I suppressed a laugh. Those sweets cost a fortune in credits. She was terrified I wouldn't oppose, T return. Inside, I briefed the twins. Aria's ocular implants dimmed with concern. I reassured her I had a flawless strategy. I booted up my holographic terminal and began drafting. I pulled schematics from my old corporate database, designing heavily armored scrap mesh mobile, interlocking barricades equipped with rotary buzzsaws and shock plating, powered by industrial servos. They would require 4 scavengers to pilot and push, acting as moving fortresses to block enemy escape routes. Next, I designed an EMP projector, a massive counterweight launcher designed to hurl volatile ionized canisters over high walls. I called Zane into the lab and projected the complex schematics. He stared at the glowing blue lines, scratching his grease-stained neck. End quote. 3 days, end quote, I told him. End quote. 3 scrap mechs and 1 EMP projector. No delays, end quote. He gave a slow nod, instantly pinging Kira to mobilize the scavengers. Everything was falling into place. The next 3 cycles were a blur of sparks, ozone, and grinding metal. Zane practically lived in the makeshift lab, his optic implants dilated as he fused scrap iron and salvaged servos into the colossal frames of the scrap mechs. Kira's scavengers worked in grueling shifts, cutting, welding, and hauling under my strict supervision. Meanwhile, I needed ocular confirmation of the target. I linked up with Valen, the cartel's silent sniper, and we traversed the toxic wasteland toward the western ravine. We deployed optical camo cloaks as we crawled along the jagged ridge, looking down into the massive fissure that housed the Cyber-Fiends. Valen adjusted his cybernetic eye, transmitting the visual feed directly to my neural link. The camp was a sprawling grid of reinforced plasteel tents, humming with generator output. Heavily augmented shock troops patrolled the perimeter. I could smell the ozone and synthetic lubricants drifting up from the valley floor. But what immediately triggered my tactical algorithms were the defensive structures. The elites had an oppose. T just dropped these troops in. They had engineered a fortress. I pointed out the anomalies to Valen. They had dug deep trenches, filling them with highly volatile, corrosive coolant sludge. That would instantly dissolve any organic infantry charge. Furthermore, their command tents were situated beneath a dense canopy of rusted pre-collapsed scaffolding, rendering aerial drone strikes completely useless. But the most glaring anomaly was the primary choke point. The ravine had only one viable entrance, yet the camp's heavy barricades faced inward, forcing any invading force to navigate a winding, exposed kill zone before reaching the actual gate. End quote. This ISN and oppose, T standard fiend protocol, end quote. I whispered over the encrypted comms. End quote. Fiends are programmed for forward assault. They don and oppose, T build corrosive moats, or staggered entry points. Someone with high-level corporate military programming designed this grid. End quote. Valen's metallic jaw clenched. He had scouted this perimeter twice and missed the strategic nuances. Now that I highlighted the overlapping fields of fire, the death trap was obvious. He asked for revised orders, assuming my scrap mechs would be torn apart in the kill zone. I shook my head. The mechs were still crucial for sealing the exit, but launching a frontal assault into that meat grinder was statistical suicide. I needed to bypass their shielding entirely. I ordered Valen to monitor the camp for the next 48 hours. The visible energy cores and ration crates could only sustain that many heavily augmented troops for a week. The bulk of their winter supplies had to be buried in a secondary, hidden bunker nearby. I instructed him to track their supply details. If they left the camp to fetch resources, he was to follow them. Leaving Valen on the ridge, I returned to Sector 7. Seeing the ravine's topography had radically altered my parameters. The EMP projector Zane was building Wooten and Appos to have the necessary arc to clear the scaffolding. I needed a custom siege mortar, a magnetic propulsion cannon capable of lobbing high-explosive payloads in a steep, vertical trajectory. I refused to let Zane or Kira's crew touch this blueprint. I didn't trust them with long-range ballistics yet. I locked myself in my private workshop. The twins, Arya and Lyra, quietly assisted me, handing me plasma torches and magnetic coils without asking unnecessary questions. Lyra finally broke the silence, asking why I was constantly building weapons of mass destruction. I paused, wiping grease from my face, and looked at her. I told her that in my old life at the upper tiers, I designed tech for people who used it to enslave others. Here, I was building an independent empire. End quote. I won and Appos to hand my creations to corporate overlords or cartel bosses. End quote. I explained. End quote. But if anyone threatens this sector, I will burn Neo-Babel to its foundation. End quote. Her ocular implants glowed with a fierce, absolute trust. She nodded, understanding the stakes. By the end of the second cycle, the siege mortar was fully operational. I calibrated the magnetic rails in the dead of night, testing the trajectory with heavy blocks of concrete. It functioned flawlessly. Right on schedule, Jax arrived with a heavily armored transport. He had successfully melted down the Water Rat Gang's armor, forging dozens of high-tensile chest plates and monomolecular blades for our new sector guard. But Jax brought something far more valuable than armor. He handed me a lead-lined canister he'd scavenged from a downed medical transport. End quote. Medical-grade synthetic nitrate. End quote. Jax grunted. End quote. Cost a fortune on the black market. End quote. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the catalyst. Mixed with refined sulfur and aluminum powder from the scrap kiln, I could synthesize thermobaric explosives. I immediately went to work, packing the chemical mixture into a reinforced shell. I took it out to the toxic dunes behind the sector, set a digital timer, and took cover behind a blast shield. The waiting felt like an eternity. Then a blinding flash, followed by a concussive shockwave that rattled my teeth and kicked up a massive cloud of irradiated dust. A crater 10 feet wide smoked in the wasteland. I exhaled a breath I didn't and Appos to realize I was holding. In the upper tiers, I had programmed orbital strikes. Now, I was hand-packing chemical bombs like a savage. But the destructive yield was undeniable. With this ordnance, the Fiends' fortified camp was nothing but a tomb. That evening, as I was recalibrating the mortar's targeting optics, my comlink violently sparked to life. It was Valen, his voice distorted by static and panic. He reported that Silas, the cartel and Appos, as brute, had located the Fiends' hidden supply bunker. But instead of just observing, the massive idiot had slaughtered the guards and seized the bunker. I nearly crushed my hydrospanner. End quote. He seized it? End quote. I growled. Silas had just detonated our element of surprise. The Fiends would miss their supply detail within hours and initiate a sector-wide lockdown. We had no time left. The assault couldn't and Appos to wait for optimal conditions. It had to happen tonight. I slammed my fist onto the alarm console. The sirens wailed across Sector 7. I grabbed my armor, gave the twins emergency lockdown protocols, and stormed into the courtyard. Kira's guards were already falling in line. End quote. Load the scrap mechs. Mount the mortar. End quote. I bellowed over the sirens. End quote. We march on the ravine now. Anyone who falls behind gets left in the dust. End quote. The siren's wail echoed off the rust-caked walls of Sector 7 as my mobilized forces pushed out into the irradiated wasteland. The toxic fog clung to the heavy treads of the 3 scrapmechs, each massive machine requiring 4 of Kira's scavengers to propel it forward. These weren't and Appos, sleek corporate vehicles. They were brutal, interlocking slabs of iron, retrofitted with industrial rotary buzzsaws and electrified shock plating. Behind them, Jax and his strongest mechanics hauled the disassembled pieces of the siege mortar, their cybernetic servos whining under the immense weight. I had left the Nova twins to initiate total lockdown protocols for our HAB unit. Nobody was getting in, and until we returned, nobody was getting out. The march was grueling, a race against the Fiends and Appos, internal clocks. Thanks to Silas prematurely hitting their supply bunker, the elites would soon realize their logistics had been severed. When we finally reached the jagged ridge overlooking the western ravine, Valen materialized from the optical camo shroud, his synthetic eye glowing a faint, anxious red. He didn't end Appos to waste time with pleasantries. He patched directly into my Neuralink, uploading the latest visual feed of the camp below. The Cyber-Fiends were already on high alert. High-intensity searchlights sliced through the smog, and heavily augmented shock troops were forming into search grids. Their central command tent was buzzing with encrypted transmissions. We had intercepted them just before they deployed their hunting parties. End quote. They know they and Appos, re-blind, end quote, Valen whispered over the comms. End quote. They and Appos, V lost the telemetry from the bunker. In exactly 10 minutes they and Appos, re going to push a mechanized vanguard out of the ravine to establish a new perimeter. End quote. End quote. Then we Don and Appos, T give them 10 minutes, end quote. I replied, my voice dead calm. I signaled Jax. End quote. Assemble the mortar. You have 3 minutes, end quote. I turned to Kira. She was clad in the high tensile chest plating Jax had forged, grasping a heavy EMP shock baton. Her face was tight, but there was no fear in her eyes, only the cold calculation of a survivor. End quote. Take the scrapmechs, end quote. I ordered. End quote. Move them down the secondary access path and plug the ravine's exit. Lock the chassis together. When the explosions start, they will rush that gate. Do not let a single corporate drone through. If they breach your wall, they will slaughter us all. End quote. Kira gave a sharp nod, signaling her squad. The scavengers engaged the silent drive servos, guiding the colossal iron beasts down into the choking darkness of the canyon entrance. On the ridge, Jax locked the final magnetic coil of the siege mortar into place. I loaded the first thermobaric shell into the chamber. It was a crude, heavy cylinder packed with synthetic nitrate and aluminum powder, but it possessed enough kinetic and chemical potential to level a city block. I stepped up to the targeting console, manually calibrating the elevation and windage. The dense canopy of rusted scaffolding below provided them cover from standard aerial strikes, but the mortar's steep, parabolic trajectory was designed to bypass it entirely. End quote. Target acquired, end quote. I muttered, locking onto the central generator hub of their camp. End quote. Magnetic rails charged. Firing, end quote. I slammed the release lever. The mortar bucked violently, a deafening electromagnetic crack shattering the night. The heavy shell vanished into the dark sky, a faint glowing streak arcing high above the ravine before plunging straight down through a gap in the scaffolding. For 2 agonizing seconds there was absolute silence. Then, the floor of the ravine erupted. The thermobaric explosion didn't end Appos. Just blast shrapnel. It ignited the very oxygen in the air. A blinding, localized sun bloomed in the center of the Fiend camp, instantly vaporizing the command tents and melting the corrosive coolant trenches into a cloud of lethal, searing steam. The concussive shockwave hit us a moment later, nearly knocking Valen off the ridge. Down below, the perfectly orchestrated corporate military grid descended into absolute, primal chaos. The Fiends were heavily augmented, designed to shrug off plasma fire and ballistic impacts, but they weren't and Appos. Shielded against a vacuum implosion that ruptured their internal cooling systems. Alarms shrieked. Burning troops stumbled blindly through the toxic steam, their optical sensors melted and their weapons systems short-circuiting. I didn't end Appos to give them a moment to. His programming overrode the panic, calculating that the artillery fire was coming from above. He raised his heavy plasma cannon and roared a command, directing the surviving vanguard to charge the canyon exit. Hundreds of heavily armed, half-melted shock troops surged forward in a desperate bid to escape the bombardment. They hit the exit, and instantly met Kira's wall. The three scrap mechs were locked shoulder to shoulder, completely sealing the narrow gorge. As the fiends crashed into the barricade, the scavengers inside pulled the activation levers. Massive industrial buzzsaws roared to life, violently chewing through the fiends' pristine corporate armor. Electrified shock plating discharged thousands of volts, frying the cybernetic implants of anyone who touched the metal. It was a meat grinder. The vanguard, unable to retreat due to the crushing weight of their own troops pushing from behind, were shoved directly into the whirring blades and high-voltage panels. Kira stood atop the central mech, her hydraulic crutch anchoring her as she swung her EMP baton, shattering the helmets of any fiend attempting to climb over. End quote. Hold the line. End quote. Kira screamed, her voice cracking over the roar of the saws. End quote. No one gets past. End quote. From the ridge, I watched the slaughter with cold satisfaction. The elites had designed these fiends to push forward relentlessly, and that rigid programming was now their undoing. They couldn't end Appos to adapt to a defensive barricade. But the commander was different. He possessed a high-level cognitive processor. Seeing the exit clogged with the shredded remains of his vanguard, he realized the gate was impassable. Through the telescopic scope of my mortar console, I saw the commander shift his focus. He looked up, his glowing blue optics locking onto the ridge where my artillery was positioned. He barked a new order, redirecting his specialized assault units away from the gate. Instead of pushing forward, the fiends began extending monomolecular climbing claws from their gauntlets, latching onto the jagged, vertical walls of the ravine. They were coming up. I smiled grimly, tapping my comlink to patch into the Rust Cartel's frequency. End quote. Wu Jiang, end quote. I broadcasted, adjusting the grip on my heavy plasma cutter. End quote. Your prey is scaling the walls. I trust Silas and your veterans are hungry. End quote. A dark, synthetic laugh crackled back through the encrypted channel. Silas had positioned his heavy enforcers all along the upper perimeter, just out of the mortar's blast radius. The fiends were climbing out of the fire, only to emerge directly into the jaws of the most ruthless gang in the upper shafts. The real battle was about to begin, and I had exactly the right tools for the job. The jagged walls of the ravine became a vertical slaughterhouse. Silas and his heavy enforcers had been waiting in the toxic smog, their hydraulic limbs humming with anticipation. As the first wave of Cyber-Fiends breached the ridge, their monomolecular climbing claws still embedded in the rock, Silas struck. He didn't end Appos to use a blade. His massive, piston-driven fists swung like wrecking balls. The first fiend's cranial plating shattered upon impact, sparking wires and blue coolant spraying into the dark air. The cartel veterans were a different breed of killer. These weren't and Appos street-level thugs. They were hardened survivors of the upper shafts. They descended upon the climbing shock troops with brutal efficiency. The fiends were already compromised, their armor warped by the thermobaric heat, their optical sensors cracked, their combat algorithms scrambling to process the ambush. Silas laughed, a deep, guttural sound echoing over the screams of tearing metal, as he ripped a plasma rifle straight from a fiend's mechanical grip and used it to bludgeon the drone into scrap. He mocked their rigid programming, roaring that the upper tiers had sent defective toys to do a soldier and Appos' job. But the pressure was mounting. More fiends poured out of the burning canyon, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the cartel's perimeter. I stepped away from the siege mortar. The heavy artillery had done its job, turning the camp into a graveyard, but it was too slow for precision strikes. I reached into my armored trench coat and unholstered my personal prototype, a compact, high-velocity coil rifle. I had machined the magnetic accelerators myself, using rare earth magnets scavenged from a downed orbital satellite. My target was the Fiend Commander. He had remained near the center of the ravine, barking encrypted orders, carefully keeping his distance from the mortar's blast radius. He assumed he was safe in the shadows, calculating that standard plasma fire couldn't and oppose T accurately reach him at this elevation. He didn't and oppose T. No, my core rifle possessed triple the range and kinetic velocity of any standard corporate sniper. I stabilized the barrel against the jutting rock, syncing the rifle's optic scope directly with my neural implant. The commander's thermal signature flared bright red against the cooling ash of his camp. I factored in the toxic crosswinds, the magnetic interference from the electrified scrap mesh below, and the drop in atmospheric pressure. By the time his advanced threat detection sensors registered the electromagnetic spike of my weapon, it was already over. I pulled the trigger. A hyper-accelerated tungsten slug tore through the smog, breaking the sound barrier with a sharp crack. It punched clean through the commander's reinforced cranial dome. The kinetic impact lifted his heavy chassis completely off the ground, hurling him backward into a smoking crater. One shot. Total system failure. Silas saw the commander fall and froze, his hydraulic fist mid-swing. The remaining fiends, instantly disconnected from their command network, faltered. Their coordinated assault dissolved into panicked, individual survival subroutines. Silas's men made quick work of the disorganized stragglers. Valen, the cartel sniper, materialized beside me, staring at my core rifle with naked, calculating greed. He slowly reached a hand toward the magnetic barrel, his synthetic eye whirring as it tried to scan my tech. Before his gloved fingers could even graze the metal, my plasma cutter was activated and pressed directly against his throat, the searing heat singeing his collar. End quote. Touch my hardware, end quote. I whispered, my voice colder than the wasteland night, end quote, and I will permanently amputate that limb, end quote. Valen yanked his hand back, sweating despite the chill, muttering a weak excuse about admiring the craftsmanship. I ordered Jax to immediately disassemble the siege mortar. Half an hour after the commander's system crashed, dawn finally broke, casting a sickly, pale yellow light through the smog. I ordered the final sweep. Kira's scavengers pushed the scrap mesh forward, crushing the last of the malfunctioning drones beneath their treads, while Silas's enforcers swept the flanks. By full daylight, the camp was completely neutralized. The air reeked of ozone, burnt synthetic flesh, and raw chemical accelerant. Wu Zhang's encrypted transmission crackled in my ear, his synthetic voice dripping with satisfaction. Rorik, his stealth operative, had secured the hidden supply bunker Silas had prematurely hit, confirming the massive stockpile of energy cores and thermal rations was intact. End quote. Finish the sweep in the valley, end quote. I ordered, ignoring Wu Zhang's self-congratulations. The immediate camp had taken the brunt of the thermobaric blasts, but the underground storage vaults built into the canyon walls were untouched. We descended into the subterranean armory. Even I was and oppose T prepared for what we found. The vaults didn't and oppose T hold standard-issue fiend weaponry, the crude, mass-produced plasma repeaters we were used to seeing. I pried open a heavy plasteel crate and froze. Inside lay rows of pristine, serialized particle beam rifles. Identical to the restricted armaments carried by the Apex Guard, the personal military force of the Neo-Babel board of directors. Every single weapon was fresh off the assembly line, gleaming with cold malice. Silas looked just as confused. The fiends had fought us with standard brute force tech last night. Why were they hoarding Apex Guard weapons? I ordered Jax to crack the adjacent armor crates. My jaw tightened. Row upon row of sleek, adaptive nanoweave tactical suits. None of this was designed for bulky cybernetic drones. This gear was tailored for human operatives. Before I could process the tactical implications, Kira marched into the vault. She shoved a prisoner forward, forcing him to his knees. End quote. Found him hiding in a reinforced bunker beneath the command tent, end quote, she reported, wiping black grease from her cheek. I stared at the prisoner. He was and oppose T a heavily augmented fiend. He didn't and oppose T have gray, synthetic skin or glowing optical sensors. He was fully human, his hair slicked back, wearing a bespoke, dirt-stained corporate suit that cost more than Sector 7's entire annual output. He was a pure-blood upper-tier handler. My expression turned to ice. If the elites were just sending fiends to purge the lower sectors, they wouldn't and oppose. T need a human handler on site, nor would they stockpile Apex Guard weapons designed for a human militia. This was and oppose a simple extermination mission. This was a staging ground for a massive, organized military coup, and they were using the lower sectors to hide their army. Kira handed me an encrypted datapad she'd stripped from his belt. The game had just changed. We weren't and oppose just fighting for scraps anymore. We had just stumbled into a war that could tear Neo-Babel apart. The subterranean vault was suffocatingly quiet, save for the hum of the portable plasma lanterns and the heavy, ragged breathing of the corporate handler. He knelt on the cold plasteel floor, his bespoke suit stained with ash and fiend coolant. Silas, the Rust Cartel's massive enforcer, hovered over him, flexing his hydraulic fists with a predatory grin. Kira stood near the entrance, her EMP baton resting casually on her shoulder, guarding the only exit. I looked down at the datapad Kira had handed me. It was heavily encrypted, secured by a biometric firewall that required corporate DNA to bypass. I glanced at the handler. He sneered, a look of utter disdain masking his obvious terror. End quote. You gutter trash have no idea what you've just derailed. End quote. The handler spat, blood dripping from his lip. End quote. I am a Tier 1 operative for the Aegis Syndicate. When the board realizes I've been compromised, they won and oppose. Just send fiends. They will glass this entire grid. You're already dead. End quote. Silas roared, raising a metallic fist to crush the man's skull. End quote. Hold. End quote. I commanded, my voice slicing through the tension. Silas froze, his optics flashing angrily, but he stepped back. I crouched in front of the operative, drawing my ceramic stealth blade. I didn't end oppose. Threaten his life. I grabbed his left hand, forcing it flat against the datapad scanner, and drove the blade straight through the back of his hand, pinning it to the screen. The operative shrieked, a high-pitched, pathetic sound, as his fresh blood pooled over the biometric sensor. The pad beeped in a cheerful, synthetic tone. DNA recognized. Access granted? I pulled the blade free, wiping it on his expensive lapel, and picked up the unlocked pad. My eyes scanned the scrolling green text of the decrypted files. What I read made the ambient temperature in the vault feel like absolute zero. It was labeled the Icarus Protocol. The elites weren't and oppose, just clearing out scavengers. A rogue faction on the Neo-Babel board of directors, the Aegis Syndicate, was staging a false flag operation. They were smuggling Apex Guard weaponry and human-fitted tactical gear into the lower sectors to arm a shadow militia. Their plan was to unleash this militia on the upper-tier loyalists, framing it as a massive underground uprising. Once the loyalist CEO was assassinated in the chaos, Aegis would seize total control of the city. But the final phase of the protocol was the real nightmare. To erase all evidence of their treason, Aegis had prepositioned localized fusion charges throughout the structural pillars of Sector 7. Once the coup was complete, they were going to detonate the charges, collapsing the entire sector into the planetary mantle. Millions of innocent drifters, workers, and scavengers would be vaporized. I projected the files onto the vault wall so Wu Jiang could read them. The cartel architect's synthetic face remained rigidly composed, but the whirring of his internal processors betrayed his panic. End quote. This is an unprecedented market shift, end quote. Wu Jiang calculated, his voice glitching slightly. He looked at the crates of particle beam rifles and then at the bleeding operative. End quote. Kaelen, do you comprehend the value of this asset? We hold a Tier 1 operative and the definitive proof of a board-level conspiracy. If we contact the Loyalist CEO, we can ransom this data for full pardons. We could buy our way into the middle tiers. End quote. I stared at Wu Jiang, realizing his corporate programming was blinding him to the tactical reality. End quote. You think the board negotiates with scavengers? End quote. I asked coldly. End quote. The second you broadcast this data, the Loyalists 1 and Oppos, T reward you. They will orbital strike the Spire to ensure the scandal never goes public. This data ISN and Oppos, T a bargaining chip, Wujang. It's a death sentence. End quote. I stepped over the operative and walked toward the crates of Apex Guard weaponry. End quote. The original contract stands. 70-30. You take the energy cores and the thermal rations to survive the winter. I am taking every single weapon in this vault. End quote. Silas stepped into my path, his hydraulics hissing. End quote. You're out of your mind, engineer. We bled for this camp. We take the guns. We sell them back to the elites. End quote. Valen, the sniper, raised his rifle a fraction of an inch. The atmosphere in the vault turned instantly volatile. Outside, I knew Kira's scavengers were still manning the scrap mechs, blocking the only exit out of the ravine. Inside, it was just me against the cartel leadership. I didn't end Oppos, to raise my voice. I simply unholstered the core rifle, letting the magnetic accelerators hum to life. The blue glow of the coils illuminated my face. End quote. Silas. End quote. I said, locking eyes with the brute. End quote. You saw what this did to a heavily augmented fiend commander. What do you think it will do to your core reactor at point-blank range? End quote. Wujang raised a pristine, synthetic hand. End quote. Stand down, Silas. End quote. He ordered sharply. End quote. The engineer's logic, while aggressively flawed, holds tactical merit. We lack the numbers to fight a prolonged war against the board. We take the rations and the cores. End quote. Silas spat a wad of synthetic oil onto the floor but backed away. The cartel had capitulated. I ordered Kira to secure the operative and begin loading the Apex Guard crates onto our heavy transports. The journey back to Sector 7 was tense, the silence only broken by the grinding of our treads over the ash-covered wasteland. When the massive blast doors of our perimeter finally hissed open, the sheer relief radiating from the settlement was palpable. Arya and Lyra were waiting in the courtyard, their optical implants glowing brightly in the dim light. Elara was there too, trying to hide her desperate relief behind a scowl, crossing her arms and muttering about how long we took. I didn't end Oppos, to have time for a prolonged celebration. I ordered the transports unloaded immediately in the center of the courtyard. Kira's scavengers, exhausted and battered from the ravine assault, gathered around the heavy plasteel crates. I kicked the lid off the first crate, revealing the gleaming particle beam rifles and the sleek, black nanoweave tactical suits. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. These were the weapons of their oppressors, the gear used by the elite guard to keep them starving in the dark. End quote. Shed your scrap metal, end quote. I bellowed, my voice carrying across the entire grid. End quote. You are no longer scavengers fighting over rusted scraps. Today, you become the apex of this sector, end quote. Under Kira's command, the guards began stripping off their crude iron plates and donning the advanced corporate armor. The nanoweave automatically adjusted to their frames, pulsing with a faint blue energy signature. When they hefted the particle beam rifles, the transformation was absolute. In less than an hour, my ragtag militia had morphed into a terrifying, high-tech paramilitary force capable of rivaling any corporate death squad. I stood on the command balcony with the twins, watching my new army fall into formation. We had the weapons. We had the intel. But as I looked up at the rusted ceiling of Sector 7, a deep, rhythmic vibration suddenly echoed through the support pillars, raining dust down upon the courtyard. The Aegis Syndicate had realized their operative was offline. The localized fusion charges were armed. The purge was beginning. The rhythmic vibration echoing through Sector 7's rusted support pillars wasn't a natural seismic event. It was the mechanical heartbeat of annihilation. Dust rained upon the courtyard, coating the newly acquired Apex Guard weaponry. The Aegis Syndicate had realized their Tier 1 operative was compromised. The localized fusion charges planted deep within our structural foundations were armed. The purge was beginning. I didn't end Appos. To give the newly armored sector guard a microsecond to process their fear, for fusion charges are strapped to the primary atmospheric pillars. Find the local network hub and sever the detonation uplink. End quote. Zane caught the pad, paling significantly beneath the grease on his face. End quote. Boss, for corporate military-grade encryption, I need a direct hard line to the main terminal. End quote. End quote. Then we go to the central hub. End quote. I stated. I turned to Kira, who was already adjusting the grip on her particle beam rifle. End quote. Kira. Aegis 1 and Appos. Trust a remote signal to wipe out a sector. They will deploy an elite sweeper team to verify the collapse. Secure the main transit elevators. Do not let them advance. End quote. Kira's eyes burned with cold determination. End quote. Consider them dead, Kaelen. End quote. She rallied her guards, their armor humming with blue energy, and sprinted toward the elevator banks. I turned to the twins, who had already drawn their sidearms. End quote. Lock down the command center. Route automated turret control directly to my neural link. End quote. Alara stepped forward, her jaw set tight despite her trembling hands. I handed her a heavy plasma pistol. End quote. Watch their backs. End quote. Jax, Zane, and I rushed toward the central atmospheric processor. The ground groaned in protest. We reached the massive, steel-reinforced hub doors. Jax didn't end Appos to wait for a passcode. His hydraulic fists punched straight through the locking mechanism, tearing the heavy plates apart. Inside the cavernous room, the main network trunk pulsed with an ominous crimson light. The countdown sequence was active. Zane sprinted to the terminal, jacking an interface cable directly from his wrist into the console. His eyes rolled back as his brain flooded with raw data streams. End quote. It's a cascading loop. End quote. Zane gasped, his body twitching. End quote. 3 minutes to critical mass. The encryption is aggressively hunting my bypass algorithms. End quote. End quote. Don and Appos. Just disarm it. End quote. I ordered, drawing my ceramic stealth blade and heavy plasma cutter. End quote. Reverse the telemetry. Send a localized EMP spike back up their command channel. I want to fry the Aegis mainframe in the upper tiers. End quote. Zane grinned, blood running from his nose as his processors overworked. End quote. Feedback loop. I like it. Give me 2 minutes. End quote. Before I could respond, the reinforced ceiling vents exploded inward. 4 figures dropped into the hub, their active camo cloaks disengaging as they hit the floor. It was an Aegis sweeper team in sleek assault armor, wielding dual monomolecular blades designed for slaughter. They moved with terrifying augmented speed. Jax roared, charging the closest sweeper. The assassin slid under the heavy blow, slicing upward. Sparks showered as the blade carved a deep groove into Jax's chest plating. Jax grunted, absorbing the hit, and backhanded the sweeper with enough force to shatter concrete. The sweeper captain ignored Jax. His optical sensors locked onto Zane, identifying the tech splicer as the primary threat to the detonation sequence. The captain lunged toward the terminal in a blur of deadly motion. I stepped into his path. The captain thrust his blade toward my throat, expecting a standard scavenger to freeze. But I knew the exact kinetic limitations of his Aegis cyberware. I had helped design the prototypes for the board. I parried the strike with my ceramic blade, letting the frictionless edge slide past my guard. As the captain's momentum carried him forward, I pivoted, driving my knee directly into the unarmored joint of his hydraulic hip actuator. A sharp crack echoed as the servos shattered. The captain stumbled, balance failing. Without hesitation, I leveled the plasma cutter at his helmet and pulled the trigger. The searing blast melted his faceplate, instantly neutralizing him. The remaining 2 sweepers hesitated, their threat assessment algorithms freezing as they watched their captain drop. That hesitation was fatal. From the shattered doorway, Kira's squad poured into the hub, unleashing a blinding barrage of particle beam fire. The ionized energy tore through the sweepers and Appos, kinetic shields, vaporizing their armor and reducing them to smoking ash. The room fell silent, save for the hum of cooling plasma. Zane suddenly gasped, yanking the cable from his wrist, collapsing onto his knees, panting heavily. End quote. Sequence reversed. End quote. Zane whispered, smiling tiredly. End quote. Detonation cancelled. I routed the feedback loops straight up their secure comms. The Aegis servers swallowed a massive EMP spike. They are completely blind. End quote. The deep rumbling beneath our feet slowly ground to a halt. The structural pillars stabilized. The crimson light shifted back to a calm, steady blue. Sector 7 was safe. I walked out of the central hub and returned to the courtyard. The entire settlement had gathered in the settling dust. Wu Jiang and Silas had arrived from the spire, watching my forces with a newfound chilling respect. They realized I wasn't Appos, just a warlord. I was a man who had crippled a corporate syndicate. Arya and Lyra rushed from the command center, their ocular implants shining with tears of relief. Alara stood back, giving me a rare, genuine smile. Kira stepped forward, resting her particle beam rifle on her shoulder. The sector guard, clad in Apex armor, looked at me with absolute, unbreakable loyalty. I looked up at the massive rusted blast doors sealing us off from the upper tiers. Aegis thought they could use us as pawns. They thought they could bury their sins in the dark. They had fundamentally miscalculated. We were no longer scavengers surviving in the shadows. We were an army armed with their own weapons, holding their darkest secrets. I holstered my plasma cutter and addressed my people. End quote. They tried to bury us today. End quote. I declared, my voice ringing across the fortified sector. End quote. But they forgot we were seeds. We hold the grid. We hold the power. And when the winter ends, end quote, I pointed toward the glittering lights of the corporate elites above. End quote. Neo-Babel is next. End quote.